Hello YouTube. The Elder Scrolls universe has some really interesting races and cultures, from the well-known playable races such as the Khajiit and Argonians to the really obscure Imga and left-handed elves. Now, today I wanted to take a look at another pretty obscure race from the Elder Scrolls universe, the Sea Elves. Now, these elves have long been a mystery to us, not getting much lore beyond a few mentions here and there, but in recent years both Bethesda Game Studios, the main developers of the series, and ZeniMax Online, the creators of the Elder Scrolls Online, have given us a lot of new lore on them to chew on. So, today I wanted to cover everything Sea Elf related, from their history to their leaders, their religion, their war tactics and so on. So, without any further ado, let's roll the intro and let's talk about the Sea Elves. So, the Sea Elves, or Maormer as they call themselves, are a race of elf found to the south of Tamriel, living primarily on the far-off jungle continent of Piandene and on some of the surrounding islands. As a race they kind of resemble High Elves, except with milky white, almost translucent skins, white eyes and several other fish-like features, with some of them apparently even having gills. Which is kinda weird, but does explain why some High Elves call them the Fish Elves, which is meant as an insult, but I get where they're coming from considering the looks and, the gills. Now, while we have a pretty decent explanation of why every race on Tamriel looks the way it does, for example with the Dunmer having their grey skin due to a punishment by Azura, we don't exactly know why the Maormer look like this. Some on Tamriel have speculated that once the common ancestor of all elves, the Aldmer, which is also the ancestor of the Sea Elves, arrived in the tropical jungles of their home continent of Piandene, they started to interbreed with intelligent beast-fish races on the island. While that would give us some explanation for how they look like, the source of this information is quite unreliable, and I would say that it may be anti-Maormer propaganda, so I don't know how reliable it is. In fact, many of the things that we know about the Maormer are pretty unreliable. You see, the Sea Elves have had a long-standing rivalry with the High Elves of the Summerset Isles, being permanently at war with the High Elves as they tried to conquer the Summerset Isles for themselves. This war for the Summerset Isles between the High Elves and the Sea Elves has been going on for literally millennia, and during that time there's been a lot of propaganda going both ways, with the Maormer themselves claiming that they, not the High Elves, are the purest race of elf, and with the High Elves coming up with any kind of dirt on the Sea Elves that they could over the years, which then found its way into a lot of sources that we have. So take a lot of the negative things in this video with a kind of a grain of salt, as it may simply be Altmer propaganda working its way into Tamriel's history books, although in recent years we also have some primary sources from the Maormer, so the picture has become a little bit more nuanced over the years. Now, with that having been said, I think it's a good idea to explain a bit about the Sea Elves' origin, so you have somewhat of an idea of why exactly they hate the High Elves so much and why the High Elves hate them with almost equal ferocity. You see, once upon a time, the Sea Elves, just like all elves when they were still the Aldmer, the ancestor race to all other elven races on Tamriel, lived on Aldmuris, the legendary home continent of the elves, which according to legends was a large island continent that lay somewhere to the southwest of Tamriel, and in ancient tapestries and texts it's described as one massive elven city that spanned the entire continent after thousands of years of prosperous expansion. Now, that continent, according to legend, eventually came to be abandoned by its inhabitants, who would flee the continent and sail to Tamriel after the continent of Aldmuris was facing a strange and undefined doom, rendering it unlivable for the ancient Aldmer. Now, all that happened in ancient history, but long before any Aldmer had to flee the continent of Aldmuris for the shores of Tamriel to then evolve into the races of elves that we know pretty well, a group of elves already left their ancient homeland of Aldmuris way earlier. And these elves, who left Aldmuris way before the others according to legend, ended up becoming the Sea Elves. The interesting thing here is that they did not leave of their own accord though, they rather were banished. You see, on Aldmuris there was an Altmer nobleman named Orgnum, and he was an extremely rich and influential man. Legends say that he did not really agree with the way the giant city continent was run, and used his wealth to launch a rebellion against the rulers of Aldmuris in these ancient times. But this rebellion would prove to be unsuccessful, as Orgnum and those who followed his rebellion were eventually defeated, and they were then banished from Aldmuris, forced to leave for distant shores. And once their ships had departed, the continent suddenly became surrounded by a magical veil of mist conjured up by the Altmer still on the continent, which prevented them from ever returning and finding the continent again. again, leaving its inhabitants once more in peace and the nobleman Orgnum and his followers exiled on some ships before the coast. Since returning to their homeland was impossible, Orgnum took his fleet and set sail to the east, where he and his followers eventually found the mysterious continent of Piandene, a large island continent covered in jungles, beaches, reefs and inland swamps, inhabited by all kinds of strange and mysterious monsters, and surrounded completely by a mysterious mist. Despite these dangers, Orgnum and his followers made the continent their home, and the nobleman Orgnum then proclaimed himself king over the exiles, who over the years would evolve into the Sea Elves that we know today. Now, something interesting is that while we already talked a bit about some of the theories as to exactly how their looks changed so dramatically from Altmer Elves, which are said to look a bit like High Elves, to the white-skinned Sea Elves with their fish features, while that theory that they interbreeded with the native beast races of Piandene is possible, I personally have a second theory. Specifically, I think that it was Orgnum, now King Orgnum, who transformed his people, using magic in order to adapt them better to their new home continent, as in their current forms they can drink salt water, are extremely nimble in the water and never get seasick. Strangely enough, they can get land sick, which is pretty funny because we see some Maormer actually complaining about having to stand on land instead of a ship or in the sea. Alright, now you see, from all that we know, Orgnum is said to be an extremely powerful and immortal wizard, with some stating that his powers is almost godlike, and some people in Tamriel going even further by proclaiming him to be some aspect of the serpent god Satakal from the Yokudan pantheon. Though that theory of him basically being a god is far from universally accepted, and it's even a blasphemous interpretation for most Redguards who worship Satakal, but it's a possibility. Now, no matter how exactly Orgnum attained his powers, we know that he is an extremely powerful wizard, and his magics have been shown to physically alter some of his people, as you'll see later in this video. So I think it's a pretty good theory that he used his immense power to change his people and adapt them to the treacherous waters and reefs of their new tropical home. Alright, now regardless of whether or not it was Orgnum who changed the Sea Elves' appearance, he is nonetheless an extremely important figure in their society and culture. And I say is, because after all these millennia it's said that he is still very much alive and still leading the Maormer. In fact, he is described as an immortal sorcerer who achieves immortality either through vampirism, strange rituals involving sacrifices, or of course divinity, like we talked about before. In fact, he's not only immortal, but he's also described by those who met him to grow younger every year. How truthful that is we don't exactly know, though we do know that he is very old, and from the very few physical descriptions that we have of him, he doesn't look like he's very old, so there may be some truth to it. Now, while we don't know an awful lot about Orgnum and how he rules his people, we do know that his will and his hatred for the Altmer, who banished him and his people from Altmuris, led him to attack and pillage the Summerset Isles many times throughout history, after the Elves who fled Altmuris landed there and made the islands their home, with sometimes less than a year going by without Orgnum leading an attack on the Isles, after they found the High Elves living peacefully on the Summerset Isles, and they really couldn't stand that, as Orgnum still holds the High Elves responsible for his ancient banishment together with his people. His hatred for the High Elves and his desire to conquer the Summerset Isles shapes the Maormer's entire society, with some Maormer who live independent of Orgnum, away from Piandene, describing that his will is almost all that most Maormer live for, as they are fiercely loyal to their deathless king and will do anything to help him achieve his goal of conquering the Summerset Isles. Now, despite millennia of trying, the Maormer and their deathless king never succeeded in conquering the Summerset Isles themselves. While they did conquer some smaller islands south of Tamriel, they never got a significant foothold on the Summerset Isles themselves, and time after time they got rebelled by the forces of the High Elves. What's funny is that there was actually a really short time at the very end of the Second Era during the Tiber Wars, when Tiber Septim tried to reunite the entire continent, when at least some Maormer allied themselves with the Summerset Isles and Valenwood, trying to stop Tiber Septim, as apparently they disliked his empire even more than they disliked the High Elves. Although that alliance quickly fell through when the High Elves left the Sea Elves out to dry when they were attacked by Imperials, and then that alliance was quickly broken, and the attacks on the Summerset Isles would then continue into deep in the Third Era. Now, the last recorded attack under the leadership of Orgnum on the Summerset Isles took place in the year 110 of the Third Era, during the War on the Isles. Then the Maormer threw everything they had at it in order to conquer the Summerset Isles, but this time the High Elves were aided by the Empire's navy and by the Sigic Order, and that combined might was so great that the entire Sea Elf armada sank, and ever since then, it's said that the Maormer never again attempted to conquer the Summerset Isles. And it's true that they've been awfully quiet on the war front ever since, though that could also have another myriad of reasons, not the least of which that perhaps the Maormer might have finally gotten rid of Orgnum after such a large defeat and probably being sick of his shit after, well, millennia. Because despite him being extremely powerful and perhaps a god, it's not like his aggressive tendencies towards the High Elf cousins have ever earned him anything more than defeat. And even by the Second Era, there were already Maormer clans and individuals who deserted Orgnum, with a large Maormer fleet that dread sails, simply sailing away during the Second Era and trying to conquer some islands west of Tamriel in an attempt to gain independence from Orgnum. And additionally, in the Elder Scrolls Online we can see several examples of Maormer who are independent of Orgnum, and once they stopped listening to his hate, or perhaps just stopped falling under some kind of spell of his influence, they no longer carried a specific ill will towards the High Elves other than just disliking them, but definitely no longer willing to throw their lives into a senseless crusade, all because their immortal king has a grudge from thousands of years ago. I'm not saying that it's certain that Orgnum was deposed, or even if it's possible if he's really a god aspect, just saying that we have seen examples where Maormer are suddenly no longer aggressive towards High Elves once they are outside the influence of their deathless king, and that ever since their biggest defeat in history, the Maormer have basically minded their own business. I mean, it's not the craziest idea, it's just speculation, but I think it could be true. Alright. Now, regardless of whether he is still in power or not, we know that Orgnum rules his people in a pretty distant, hands-off manner, because the clans of Piandene and their independent Maormer privateer fleets have lots of freedom, even politically, as they can ally themselves with almost everyone and act as mercenaries on Tamriel, as long as it benefits Orgnum in the end, although most of them usually resort to piracy and privateering in Orgnum's name, especially against the High Elves. The Maormer even have quite a lot of internal strife on Piandene, it's said, with internal Maormer negotiations often ending in blood spilled, and even at Orgnum's court it's said that there's a lot of fighting and conflict, and Orgnum doesn't really seem to mind any of it, as long as they all swear personal fealty to him and mobilize when he wants to do one of his Summerset Isles invasions again. Now, we don't know what Piandene looks like. What I've been showing you is basically artistic interpretation and some footage of jungles. But we do know that on the continent and around it, the Maormer are organized in several clans on the continent and fleets around the continent, which both seem to have their own political independence to a degree within Maormer culture. Some clans are apparently led by princes, while independent fleets are apparently governed by so-called sea lords. They all seem to be somewhat independent, with all of them only being held together by their shared fealty to Orgnum. Now, other than that, there's really not all that much that we know about their culture, but here's some interesting things from what we do know. First of all, they dislike the High Elves. A lot, if that wasn't clear to you yet. While those independent of Orgnum seem to be less aggressive towards them, even they say that they'd rather be locked in a room with a mutineer than with a High Elf, and in their society, having sex with a High Elf is considered treason, and having a relationship with one is considered to be the ultimate taboo and unforgivable, even to some of the independent Maormer. The funny thing is that we actually know that Orgnum himself did have an affair with a High Elf lady at some point, and his Maormer subjects don't seem to mind that. Oh, and by the way, he also had sex with Petema during a political summit where she tried to get his aid in her war against Central Imperial authority. Grand. Now, other than that, we know that they worship several gods. We know that they worship the serpent god Satakal, for example, which could be a hint towards there being a grain of truth to Orgnum's divinity. But they also seem to worship Sirabane, and they acknowledge the Daedra, as we have examples of Maormer Molag Bal and Hermaeus Mora worshippers, though we don't know if they are present in their pantheon at large or not. We also sometimes hear them refer to a deity unique to them, which is called Mother Sea, which seems to be some kind of personification or deity controlling the sea, and as far as I'm aware, isn't worshipped by anyone else. Now, we also know that in battle, especially at sea, the Maormer are extremely effective, with them using gigantic sea serpents that we talked about before on the channel as war beasts and mounts in the water, and using tamed reef vipers as sort of aquatic attack dogs. In battles with other ships on the high seas, they are some of the most feared adversaries, as their storm mages can manipulate the winds to either slow down or straight up push over enemy ships, making them an easy target for Maormer boarding parties on their fast ships, some of which are said to look like gigantic floating insects with membrane-like sails, although they are also known to use more traditional types of ships. When they board enemy ships, the most fearsome boarders of their boarding parties are the so-called Maormer Leviathans, extremely tall Maormer with scaled skins and hunched backs. These Leviathans are very strange beings, as their entire anatomy seems to have been deformed as they became bigger, stronger and more aggressive beings, which even require other Maormer to be kept in check, as otherwise they sometimes randomly start attacking people in a strange aggressive rage. How exactly these Maormer Leviathans came into existence we don't know, though there has been speculation that they are a result of magical interbreeding between Maormer and sea serpents, likely due to King Orgnum's mystical serpent magics, which also allowed the Maormer to tame the sea serpents in the first place. Now, this magical ability that Orgnum possesses to cross his people with the sea serpents and change their entire being is also the basis for my speculation on that it was Orgnum's magic which transformed the Altmer, who were exiled with him, into the current Maormer, who are far more adapted to sea life and life on Pianine. Now, there's a few other things that we know about Maormer society. For one, we know that tattoos have a hefty significance in their society. We also know that getting stranded with someone together on an island or a raft after a shipwreck is considered to be a fate pairing for romance. And we know that they keep small sea creatures as pets, and some clans also seem to revere sea witches as a sort of shaman. Now, other than that, I think I covered almost everything about the Maormer, and I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this video and that I managed to teach you something new about the Elder Scrolls lore today. And if I did, why not leave a like, as that's how the mighty algorithm decides which content is worthy and which isn't. That being said, all there's left for me to do is to vocally thank my top Patreon supporters: Mr. Bernardo Binda, His Soul, Gabriel Binda, Doji, K-Legend M, King Chris, Lance Vandertooth, Volker of Argonia, RP the Beast, Devin Mattingly, Rakai, and Sword of Bushido. They and all the others on screen make my videos possible, and for that I am very grateful. That said, I'll see all of you in the next Elder Scrolls lore video. Probably next week. Bye bye.